So, hello to all, and special thanks to the organizers for managing to organize this symposium despite these unfortunate pandemic conditions. The topic of my today's talk will be determining criteria and sub-criteria weights for the selection of regional centers of competence in Croatia. This is a joint work with my dear colleagues Blazenka, Divjak, Nina Begicevic, Redjep, and myself. You had the opportunity to listen Blaženka's talk about leadership in chaotic and complex situations the day before yesterday. So, here's the structure of my presentation, and I'll give my best to stick to the time schedule. First, we'll get to know ourselves with the context of this process from the title. Next, we'll analyze the methodology applied and at the end try to carry out some conclusions. So, in accordance with the strategy of education, science and technology adopted by Croatian Parliament in the year 2014, government of the Republic of Croatia 2 years later adopted this program for development of the vocational education and training system. The crucial innovation in this program was the establishment of the regional centers of competence, or RCCs. Those centers are planned to be the places of excellence in vocational education and training for people of all ages. Founding of this huge step for Croatian vocational education was planned within EU, European Union funds amounting to almost 500 million euros. So quite an amount. The minister decided to introduce 25 centers across all Croatian counties in 5 priority areas: electrotechnics and mechanics, computer science, agriculture, tourism, and healthcare. In 2018, that's 4 years after the program adoption, the Ministry of Science and Education was responsible for creating a document named the Network of Regional Centers of Competence, and it had to include all the parameters and criteria for the selection of those centers. For this selection process to be carried out transparently and with expertise, criteria and sub-criteria weights had to be determined. And this is where we get in. In this process of determining criteria and sub-criteria weights, there are some key elements that need to be emphasized. First, criteria for the RCC selection were predefined within the National Vocational Education and Training Act. This means that the criteria were given to us. Next, there exists the National Council for Vocational Education, consisting of 21 members, whose role was stated in the Act for Vocational Education and Training. And this role was to give a preliminary opinion to the minister on the adoption of the network document mentioned before, and designation of regional centers of competence as well. This means that the council members needed to be included in this decision-making process. And the third key thing was the overall large setting with 12 criteria, which we regrouped a bit to obtain 10 of them, and total of 64 sub-criteria. Having all these elements in mind, the question was what methodology to use. Here is methodology described in short, and in subsequent slides we'll go a bit deeper describing each of these 3 elements. Since the council needed to be included, the logical choice was to do a group decision-making with council members as decision-makers. For determining the criteria weights, we decided to use pairwise comparison, meaning AHP, so the council members could carefully compare criteria. And at the end, we used simple rankings method to determine the sub-criteria weights, since the majority of criteria had between 7 and 12 sub-criteria, which would result in a lot of new pairwise comparison. Now, let's go item by item. As said before, the Council for Vocational Education members were the decision makers. 14 out of 21 of them were able to attend the workshop that we organized to facilitate the decision-making process. The members were divided into groups according to their expertise and background to discuss the importance of criteria and sub-criteria. There was a group of headmasters, municipality representatives, union representatives, ministry representatives, and higher education and agencies representatives. We also gave them a questionnaire, a paper questionnaire, for individual pairwise comparisons and rankings. We managed to decrease the number of criteria to 10, but this is still a situation to expect some inconsistency from the decision makers, especially since the council members lack experience in this kind of activity. So, how to deal with inconsistency? We could repeat the inconsistent pairwise comparisons because we couldn't repeat the inconsistent pairwise comparisons because it would took a great amount of time, and we decided to assign weights to each decision maker. You can find this weight approach in the papers listed below. The weights depended on the consistency index, and the smaller, the better approach was achieved by inverting the consistency indices and normalizing them by the sum. You can see the formula here on the slide. Now we proceed to the criteria itself. You can see them listed here on the slide. At the beginning, there were 12 of them, and then we combined this gravitational index and county development index because they were two similar number criteria, and again spatial and material conditions with accommodation capacity, again based on the similarity of the two. As said before, pairwise comparison was used for the criteria weights where individual comparisons were aggregated entry-wise using the weighted geometric mean, the standard way to aggregate those matrices, individual matrices. Again, you can find the formula here on the slide.
2 minutes left.
Sub-criteria. They were more explicit, more concrete than the criteria. You can see here the example of sub-criteria belonging to the criterion school project activities. You can see here numbers and proportions. Like I said before, each criterion had between 7 and 12 sub-criteria, which sums up to the total of 64 sub-criteria. During a pairwise comparisons, here would not be a good solution because it would produce a large number of comparisons. So our proposition was to use ranks to determine sub-criteria weights. In such a large setting, it was appropriate and good enough. Aggregation of the judges' ranks was done according to this table. First place brought n-1 point, second n-2, and so on. Normalization of the overall points was done by sum, which then gave us the needed weights. What can we conclude at the end? The reliability of the judgments is the potential alert here, whose effect on we wanted to minimize in a way that we did here by using weights. We can consider our combination of methods successful in this context because the process ended with acceptable results. 25 RCCs were selected and they were given access to EU funding. we can say that such a high-stake complex decisions at the national level can be supported to assure transparency and acceptance by all stakeholders. And now, at the end, everyone's favorite slide. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bojan. Do we have a question? Anyone have a question here?
Please feel free to ask questions.
I have a question. If I understand, you weighted the responses according to the consistency ratio. So I guess the lower the consistency ratio, the more weight.
Yeah, the smaller, the better approach. Smaller consistency, bigger weight. Yeah.
But do you use any kind of how do you say, threshold? For example, if somebody had a consistency of 1, would that be discarded? We have, in other words, did everybody have some weight independently of how bad the consistency was?
Yeah, there were 14 decision makers, and 7 out of 14 were inconsistent. And the situation showed that merely the politicians were inconsistent, in these pairwise comparisons. So no one had such a bad or good consistency. And at the end, when we presented the results, the obtained weights, all the council members were satisfied with the obtained weights.
Thank you.
Yeah.